Watch this Middle Eastern man in white robes lighting books on fire in his study. His name is Mujtaba, a respected Saudi Imam celebrating his act of defiance. Then something unexplainable happens. His hands shake, papers scatter, he collapses to his knees.
My name is Mujtaba. On July 11th, 2018, I was a 45-year-old Imam in Riyadh. I led prayers for thousands, taught Islamic theology for 20 years. That Tuesday afternoon, I committed what I thought was a righteous act. I had no idea it would destroy everything I believed. For 23 years, I held one of the most respected positions in our community. I was Imam Mujtaba, spiritual leader of Al-Noor Mosque in the heart of Riyadh. Every Friday, over 2,000 men would fill our prayer hall, hanging on every word I spoke during khutbah. My voice carried weight not just in religious matters, but in community disputes, family conflicts, and moral guidance. The government officials knew my name. The religious council sought my opinions. I was somebody who mattered. My journey to this position began when I was barely 18, fresh from memorizing the entire Quran. I spent 7 years studying Islamic jurisprudence at the Islamic University of Medina, where I graduated summa cum laude. My professors praised my dedication to preserving pure Islamic teaching. By age 25, I was already leading prayers at a smaller mosque. By 30, I had my own congregation. By 40, I was recognized as one of the most knowledgeable scholars in our district. But my specialty, what really set me apart from other imams, was my ability to refute other religions. Every Thursday evening, I held what we called truth defense sessions, where I would systematically dismantle the beliefs of Christians, Jews, Hindus, and other faiths. I had studied their scriptures not to understand them, but to find their weaknesses, their contradictions, their obvious fabrications. The community loved these sessions. Parents would bring their teenage sons to learn how to defend Islam against foreign influences. Christianity was my particular target. I had memorized dozens of verses from the Bible that seemed to contradict each other. I knew every historical criticism, every scholarly debate about authorship, every archaeological question mark. During my sermons, I would dramatically hold up a Bible and point out what I called its obvious corruptions. The congregation would nod approvingly as I explained how the original message of Prophet Isa had been twisted by Paul and later church councils. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been so certain of something you would stake your entire life on it? That was me with Islam. I did not just believe it intellectually, I lived it, breathed it, built my entire identity around defending it. When I looked in the mirror each morning, adjusting my prayer cap, I saw a warrior for truth. I genuinely believed that Christians were not just wrong, but dangerously misguided people who had been deceived by centuries of lies. My sermons against Christianity were not born from hatred, but from what I thought was compassion. I truly believed these people were heading toward eternal punishment because they had been fed false teachings about God having a son, about Trinity, about salvation through Christ instead of good deeds. In my mind, I was trying to save them from their delusion. Every Friday, I would end my khutbah with prayers for Allah to guide these lost souls away from their shirk, their association of partners with God. The respect I commanded in our community was intoxicating. When I walked through the marketplace, shopkeepers would stop their conversations to greet me with deep bows. Children would run to kiss my hand. Women would ask their husbands to seek my counsel on family matters. I felt like I was carrying the weight of spiritual authority that Allah had entrusted to me. This was not just a job or even a calling. This was my identity, my purpose, my entire reason for existing. My family basked in the honor that came with my position. My wife wore the finest hijabs, and other women would seek her advice on raising righteous children. My 3 sons were automatically accepted into the best Islamic schools because of their father's reputation. My elderly mother would tell her friends that Allah had blessed her with a son who was protecting the faith. At community gatherings, people would make space for us at the head table. We were religious royalty, but it was not just social status that drove me. I genuinely, passionately believed that I was doing God's work. Every time I exposed what I saw as Christian lies, every time I helped a young Muslim resist missionary influences, every time I strengthened someone's Islamic faith, I felt a deep satisfaction that I was pleasing Allah. I would spend hours in preparation for my anti-Christian lectures, praying for Allah to give me wisdom to defend His truth effectively. My library contained over 300 books about comparative religion, most of them focused on refuting Christianity. I had copies of the Bible in Arabic, English, and Urdu, all heavily annotated with notes about contradictions and historical problems. I subscribed to Islamic apologetics journals and attended conferences where scholars would present new arguments against Christian theology. This was my academic passion, my intellectual battlefield. The foreign workers in our city knew to avoid me. Word had spread through their communities that Imam Mujtaba was particularly harsh toward Christians. If any of them were caught with Bibles or Christian materials, they knew those items would eventually end up on my desk for examination and disposal. I had personally confiscated and destroyed dozens of Bibles, Christian books, and gospel tracts over the years. I saw this as protecting our community from spiritual contamination. Looking back now, I realize how deeply my pride was woven into my religious identity. I was not just defending Islam. I was defending my reputation as the man who could demolish any Christian argument. My congregation expected me to have answers, and I always did. My confidence was unshakable because I had spent decades building an intellectual fortress around my beliefs. I thought I was invincible in religious debate. That was the man I was on July 11th, 2018. Absolutely certain, completely committed, totally unprepared for what was about to shatter my entire world. It started with Ahmad, a Filipino construction worker who had been employed at one of the new shopping complexes being built in our district. The site supervisor, a devout Muslim and member of my congregation, had discovered Ahmad reading what appeared to be a small black book during his lunch break. When confronted, Ahmad tried to hide the book, but the supervisor seized it immediately. It was a Bible, written in English with Arabic translations in the margins. The supervisor brought both Ahmad and the Bible to me that same afternoon. This was standard procedure in our community. Any religious materials found among foreign workers were to be confiscated and examined by religious authorities. Ahmad stood nervously in my office, his work clothes still dusty, his hands shaking slightly as he watched me flip through his Bible. I had handled many such cases before, but something about Ahmad's expression struck me. He was not just afraid of losing his job. He looked like a man watching his most precious possession being examined by someone who might destroy it. I dismissed Ahmad with a warning about respecting local customs and sent him back to work. The supervisor expected me to dispose of the Bible immediately, as I had done countless times before. But as I sat alone in my office that evening, something compelled me to examine this particular book more closely. Perhaps it was the careful way Ahmad had annotated the margins, or the worn condition of the pages that suggested years of devoted reading. Whatever the reason, I decided this Bible would serve a different purpose. For weeks, I had been preparing a special sermon series called Exposing Christian Deceptions for the upcoming Ramadan season. My plan was to systematically refute Christian theology using their own scriptures against them. I had delivered similar series before, but this time I wanted to be more thorough, more devastating in my critique. Ahmad's Bible, with its Arabic translations, would be the perfect resource for finding fresh contradictions and problematic passages to highlight. That night, I took the Bible home and began what I thought would be a simple research project. I started with the Gospel of John, knowing it contained some of the strongest claims about Jesus' divinity. My intention was to compile a list of verses that contradicted Islamic teaching, then cross-reference them with historical criticism to show how these ideas had been added later by overzealous followers. But as I read, something unexpected began happening. Instead of finding easy targets for refutation, I found myself drawn into the narrative in ways I had not anticipated. The stories were familiar to me from Islamic teachings about Prophet Isa, but the details were richer, more intimate. The Jesus portrayed in these pages was not the distant, purely human prophet I had been taught about. This Jesus spoke with authority about forgiveness, performed miracles with compassion, and claimed a relationship with God that was both shocking and strangely compelling. I tried to maintain my scholarly objectivity, but the more I read, the more frustrated I became. These were not the crude fabrications I had expected to find. The moral teachings were profound, the philosophical concepts sophisticated, the emotional depth undeniable. How could billions of people have been deceived by something so obviously false if it was as flimsy as I had always claimed? The cognitive dissonance was becoming uncomfortable. Over the next several days, I continued my study with increasing agitation. I read the Sermon on the Mount and found myself unable to fault its ethical framework. I examined the parables and discovered layers of wisdom that impressed me despite my resistance. I studied the crucifixion accounts and felt an unexpected emotional response to the portrayal of suffering and sacrifice. This was not going according to my plan. The more I read, the angrier I became. Not angry at the text itself, but angry at how difficult it was proving to dismiss. I had built my reputation on being able to demolish Christian arguments effortlessly. Yet here I was struggling to find the obvious flaws I had always claimed existed. My annotations in the margins started becoming more aggressive, my counter-arguments more forced. I was fighting the book rather than simply analyzing it. By the end of the second week, my frustration had reached a boiling point. I realized that my intended sermon series was in jeopardy because I could not find the clear-cut ammunition I needed. The verses I had planned to use as examples of Christian corruption were proving more complex and nuanced than I had remembered. Some of the historical criticisms I had relied on for years seemed less definitive when I examined them closely against the actual text. The final breaking point came when I reached John chapter 14, where Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I had used this verse hundreds of times as an example of Christian arrogance and exclusivism. But as I read it in context, sitting alone in my study, late at night, something about the directness of the claim unsettled me in a way I could not explain. It was not just arrogant, it was either the statement of a madman or something far more significant. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If I could not effectively refute this book through study and argument, I would make my point through dramatic action. I would film myself burning this Bible, creating a powerful visual lesson for my congregation about how to deal with false scriptures. The burning would be symbolic of truth conquering falsehood, light overcoming darkness, pure Islamic teaching destroying Christian corruption. I set up my phone camera on a tripod in my home office, arranging my most treasured Islamic books around my desk as witnesses to what I was about to do. I placed Ahmad's Bible in the center, open to the passage that had disturbed me most. I would light it on fire while delivering a short lecture about the dangers of allowing false scriptures to contaminate Muslim communities. The video would be perfect for my sermon series and could even be shared online as an educational tool. As I prepared to begin recording, I felt a surge of righteous satisfaction. This was how a true defender of Islam should handle the enemies of faith. No more intellectual wrestling with confusing passages or troubling questions, just decisive action that would settle the matter once and for all. I was about to teach the ultimate lesson about false scriptures, and I could hardly wait to see the look of approval on my congregation's faces when I showed them the footage. I had no idea I was about to light a fire that would consume everything I thought I knew about God. I positioned the camera carefully, making sure the angle captured both my face and the desk where Ahmad's Bible lay open among my Islamic texts. The afternoon sun streamed through my office window, creating what I thought would be perfect lighting for my demonstration. I had rehearsed my opening words several times, planning to speak about the necessity of protecting our community from spiritual pollution before dramatically lighting the match. I pressed record and began speaking with the confidence that had made me a respected Imam for over 2 decades. Brothers and sisters, today I show you how we must deal with the lies that threaten our pure faith. My voice was steady, authoritative, exactly the tone my congregation had come to expect from their spiritual leader. I held up Ahmad's Bible, explaining how foreign workers were attempting to spread their corrupted teachings among our people. This book claims that Allah has a son, that God died on a cross, that salvation comes through someone other than Allah alone. I flipped through the pages dismissively, pointing out what I called obvious fabrications and contradictions. Today, you will see what every faithful Muslim should do when confronted with such blasphemy. I placed the Bible back in the center of my desk, opened to the passage in John that had troubled me most. I reached for the box of matches I had placed nearby, my movements deliberate and confident. The camera was capturing everything perfectly. This would be a powerful teaching tool, a visual reminder of how true believers should respond to false scriptures. I struck the first match, watching the small flame dance in the afternoon light, filtering through my window. Watch how truth conquers falsehood, I declared, bringing the match toward the open pages of the Bible. The flame touched the thin paper, and immediately small tongues of fire began consuming the words. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching the verses about Jesus' divinity curl and blacken under the flames. This was justice, I thought. This was righteousness in action. But within seconds of the fire taking hold, something inexplicable began to happen. The temperature in my sealed office suddenly spiked dramatically. Not the gentle warmth you would expect from a small fire on my desk, but an overwhelming, suffocating heat that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. I looked around confused, wondering if my air conditioning had malfunctioned, but the intensity was far beyond anything mechanical. My hands, which had been steady while lighting the match, began shaking uncontrollably. At first, I thought it was just adrenaline from the dramatic moment I was creating, but the trembling quickly became so violent that I could barely maintain my grip on anything. I tried to steady myself by gripping the edge of my desk, but my entire body was beginning to convulse with tremors I could not control. Then the wind started. In my completely enclosed office, with all windows shut and doors closed, a powerful gust began swirling around the room. Papers from my desk scattered in all directions. My carefully arranged Islamic books tumbled to the floor, and the curtains billowed wildly despite being nowhere near an open window. I stood frozen in shock, trying to understand what natural phenomenon could possibly explain what was happening. Look inside your own heart right now and remember a moment when you felt absolutely terrified, when your rational mind could not process what your senses were telling you. That was me in that instant, watching my ordered world literally blown into chaos while a Bible burned on my desk. The wind was not a gentle breeze, but a forceful, swirling presence that seemed to have intelligence and purpose behind it. The heat continued intensifying until I felt like I was standing inside an oven. Sweat poured down my face and soaked through my thobe, but this was not ordinary perspiration. My entire body was reacting to something far beyond the physical environment. Every nerve ending felt electrified, every muscle tensed with an energy I had never experienced before. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. That is when my legs gave out completely. Without warning, my knees buckled and I collapsed to the floor beside my desk. I had not chosen to kneel. My body simply could not remain standing under the weight of whatever presence had filled my office. The camera continued recording from its tripod, capturing my bewildered expression as I struggled to understand what was happening to me. The sensation of presence was the most overwhelming part of the entire experience. I could not see anything supernatural, no glowing figures or mystical visions, but I was absolutely certain that I was no longer alone in that room. Something powerful, something far greater than myself, had entered my space and was making its reality known in ways that bypassed my intellect and spoke directly to my soul. Tears began streaming down my face, though I had no idea why I was crying. These were not tears of fear or pain, but something else entirely. Something deep within me was responding to this presence with an emotion I could not name or control. My theological training had not prepared me for anything like this. 23 years of religious scholarship offered no framework for understanding what was occurring in my own office. The Bible continued burning throughout all of this, but I noticed something strange about the flames. While paper scattered everywhere and wind whipped through the room, the fire remained contained to just the Bible itself. None of my other books caught fire, despite being knocked around by the wind. My desk did not burn. Even loose papers that blew near the flames were not ignited. The fire seemed to have a boundary, a purpose that defied normal physics. I remained on my knees, unable to stand, unable to speak, unable to do anything but experience this overwhelming encounter with something that challenged every assumption I had about reality. The heat, the wind, the presence, the uncontrollable physical responses, all combined to create a moment that would be seared into my memory forever. I was no longer Imam Mujtaba, respected religious authority. I was just a man, small and powerless, confronted by something infinitely greater than myself. The video camera captured it all. Though I would not be able to watch the footage for weeks afterward, in that moment I was not thinking about sermons or congregations or defending Islam. I was simply trying to survive an encounter that was rewriting everything I thought I knew about God, about truth, about the very nature of spiritual reality itself. The supernatural event lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the heat finally subsided and the impossible wind stilled, I remained on my knees beside my desk, staring at the smoldering remains of Ahmad's Bible. The pages had burned completely, leaving only ash and the binding. Yet somehow the fire had extinguished itself, without spreading to anything else in the room. My scattered papers lay everywhere, my Islamic books were strewn across the floor, but nothing else showed any sign of heat damage. I struggled to my feet on trembling legs, my mind racing to find rational explanations for what had just occurred. Perhaps there had been a gas leak that caused hallucinations. Maybe I had suffered some kind of medical episode, a seizure or panic attack that distorted my perceptions. The air conditioning must have malfunctioned simultaneously with a window seal breaking to create the wind effect. I grasped desperately for any natural explanation that would allow me to dismiss what I had experienced. But my body knew better than my mind. Every cell still vibrated with the memory of that presence. My hands continued shaking for hours afterward. The overwhelming sense that something divine had touched my life refused to be reasoned away, no matter how hard I tried to construct alternative narratives. Deep in my soul, beneath all my theological training and rational skepticism, I knew that I had encountered something real and powerful and completely outside my understanding of how the world worked. I spent the rest of that afternoon cleaning up my office, trying to restore the normal order that had been so dramatically disrupted. As I gathered the scattered papers and rearranged my books, I kept glancing at the ash pile where the Bible had been, half expecting it to spontaneously combust again or somehow reconstitute itself. The smell of burned paper lingered in the air, a constant reminder that something extraordinary had happened in my ordinary space. When my wife came home that evening, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. I had always been able to maintain my composure, to project the calm authority expected of a religious leader, but that night I could barely string together coherent sentences. She asked if I was feeling ill, if perhaps I had been fasting too intensely or working too many late hours preparing sermons. I told her I was just tired, that I had been studying particularly challenging theological questions. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived those moments of supernatural encounter. I would feel again the inexplicable heat, the impossible wind, the overwhelming presence that had forced me to my knees. I tried praying in Arabic as I had done every night for decades, but the familiar words felt hollow and mechanical. Something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with prayer, with God, with the very act of spiritual communication. I told my wife it was just exhaustion from fasting, but that was a lie. I had fasted during Ramadan my entire adult life without any physical or mental complications. This was something entirely different, something that had shaken me to my core in ways I could not explain to anyone, least of all to her. How could I tell the woman who had built her identity around being an imam's wife that her husband was questioning everything he had ever taught about God? The next few days passed in a haze of internal turmoil. I continued my regular duties, leading prayers and meeting with community members, but I felt like I was acting in a play where I had forgotten my lines. The confident certainty that had always characterized my religious leadership was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that grew stronger each day. I found myself stumbling over familiar prayers, losing my train of thought during sermons, struggling to maintain the authoritative presence my congregation expected. I became obsessed with finding another Bible. The need consumed my thoughts day and night. I had to understand what had happened in my office, had to discover what was in that book that had provoked such an extraordinary response. But obtaining a Bible in Saudi Arabia, especially for someone in my position, was extremely dangerous. Foreign workers were sometimes allowed to possess religious materials for private use, but an imam caught with Christian scriptures would face severe consequences from both religious and civil authorities. So I'm asking you, just as a teacher would, what do you do when your certainties crumble and you desperately need answers, but seeking those answers could destroy your entire life? That was my dilemma. Every rational part of my mind told me to forget what had happened, to dismiss it as a momentary aberration, and return to my normal religious duties. But a deeper part of my soul, awakened by that supernatural encounter, refused to let the questions go. I began having dreams unlike any I had ever experienced before. Not the ordinary dreams of daily life, or even the spiritual dreams that religious texts describe, but vivid, intense encounters that felt more real than waking consciousness. In these dreams, I would see brilliant light that did not hurt my eyes, hear voices speaking in languages I did not recognize, but somehow understood, feel that same overwhelming presence that had filled my office during the burning incident. In one particularly powerful dream, I found myself standing in a vast library filled with books in every language imaginable. A figure whose face I could never quite see clearly handed me a book and said, "Read with an open heart, not just with your mind." When I looked down at the book, it was a Bible, but written in Arabic script that seemed to glow with its own internal light. I woke from that dream with tears streaming down my face and an even more desperate need to understand what was happening to me. My internal war intensified with each passing day. Everything I had been trained to believe about Christianity told me these experiences were either demonic deceptions or psychological breakdowns brought on by stress and overwork. But the peace I felt during the dreams, the sense of love and acceptance that accompanied the supernatural encounters, did not feel evil or deceptive. It felt like coming home to a truth I had always known, but never acknowledged. I started questioning not just Christianity, but the very foundations of my Islamic faith. Had I been wrong about the nature of God? Had I spent decades teaching falsehoods to thousands of people who trusted my spiritual guidance? The possibility terrified me more than any physical threat I had ever faced. If I had been wrong about something so fundamental, then everything I had built my life upon was a lie. The weight of these questions was crushing. I had to find answers, had to understand what was calling to my soul with such persistent intensity. But I also knew that the search for truth might cost me everything I had ever valued. My position, my family, my community, my very identity as a Muslim leader. I stood at a crossroads where every path forward seemed to lead through devastating loss. 3 weeks after the burning incident, I managed to obtain another Bible through a contact I had never expected to use for such a purpose. There was a small community of expatriate workers from the Philippines who attended a secret Christian fellowship that met in private homes. Through careful, indirect inquiries with one of the construction supervisors, who was sympathetic to foreign workers, I learned that these gatherings existed and that they might be willing to help someone seeking to understand their faith. The risk I was taking cannot be overstated. If any member of my congregation or the religious authorities had discovered that I was secretly meeting with Christians, my career would have ended immediately. But more than that, in our conservative region, such actions could result in imprisonment or worse. I was literally risking my life to pursue answers to questions I could no longer ignore. I met with a Filipino nurse named Maria who worked at the local hospital. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in a different district where I was unlikely to be recognized. I told her I was conducting research for a comparative religion project, though I suspect she sensed there was more to my inquiry than academic interest. When I asked if she could provide me with a Bible for my studies, she studied my face carefully before agreeing to help. That night, I took the new Bible to my home office and began reading with an intensity and openness I had never allowed myself before. This time, I was not looking for ammunition to use against Christianity. I was genuinely seeking to understand what had triggered such a powerful supernatural response during my attempted burning. I read the Gospels, cover to cover, then moved through Acts, Romans, and the other epistles. The more I read, the more I found myself confronted with a version of Jesus that bore little resemblance to the diminished prophet Isa I had been taught about in Islamic tradition. This Jesus claimed not just to be a messenger from God, but to be God himself in human form. He forgave sins, accepted worship, and spoke with an authority that was either blasphemous madness or divine truth. There seemed to be no middle ground. What struck me most powerfully was the consistent message of grace and redemption that ran throughout the Christian scriptures. In Islam, I had always taught that salvation came through good deeds outweighing bad ones, through following religious law perfectly, through earning God's approval through human effort. But this Jesus offered something completely different: forgiveness and eternal life as free gifts, based not on human performance, but on God's love and sacrifice. The internal struggle this created was excruciating. Everything in my religious training told me this was impossible, that it contradicted the fundamental nature of divine justice. Yet something deep within my soul responded to this message of grace with a longing I had never felt before. For the first time in my life, I began to understand that I was not good enough, had never been good enough, could never be good enough to earn God's favor through my own efforts. I began praying, but not the formal Islamic prayers I had performed 5 times daily for decades. These were desperate, honest conversations with God where I admitted my confusion, my fear, and my growing conviction that everything I had believed might be wrong. I prayed in Arabic, in English, sometimes just in wordless groans of spiritual anguish. I was not sure who I was praying to anymore, but I knew I needed divine guidance more than I had ever needed anything. The dreams became more frequent and more vivid. In one particularly powerful vision, I saw myself standing before a great throne, surrounded by indescribable light. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere asked me, Mujtaba, why are you persecuting me? When I replied that I had never persecuted anyone, the voice said, when you persecute my followers and burn my words, you persecute me. The connection to the Apostle Paul's Damascus Road experience was not lost on me, though at that time I was only beginning to understand the parallel. After 6 weeks of secret study and increasingly desperate prayer, I reached a breaking point. I could no longer maintain the facade of confident Islamic leadership, while my soul was crying out for something entirely different. Late one night, alone in my office with the Bible open before me, I finally surrendered. I knelt on the same spot where I had collapsed during the supernatural encounter and spoke words I never thought I would say. Jesus, if you are real, if you are who this book claims you are, show me the truth. I give up trying to figure this out with my mind. I surrender my pride, my position, everything I thought I knew about God. If you are the way to the Father, then I want to follow you, no matter what it costs me. The moment I spoke those words, the same overwhelming presence I had felt during the burning incident filled my office again. But this time, instead of fear and confusion, I felt an indescribable peace and love that seemed to penetrate every cell of my being. I wept uncontrollably, but these were tears of relief and joy rather than terror. For the first time in my life, I felt truly forgiven, truly accepted, truly loved by God without conditions or performance requirements. I remained on my knees for over an hour, overwhelmed by the reality of what had just happened to me. I had become a Christian, not just intellectually or theologically, but in the deepest part of my soul. Jesus Christ was no longer a false prophet or misguided teacher from my Islamic worldview. He was my Lord and Savior, the one who had died for my sins and risen from the dead to offer me eternal life. The immediate consequence of my conversion was the crushing realization that everything would have to change. I could not continue leading Islamic prayers and delivering sermons about the supremacy of Islam while secretly believing that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But I also knew that revealing my conversion would mean losing everything: my position, my income, my family relationships, my social standing, potentially even my safety. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror while preparing for morning prayers and saw a completely different person. Outwardly, I appeared the same face, same prayer cap, same Imam's robes. But inwardly, I had been transformed in ways that went beyond description. I was no longer Imam Mujtaba defending Islam against Christian lies. I was Mujtaba the Christian, trying to figure out how to live this new faith in a context where it could cost me everything I had ever valued. The weight of this secret was overwhelming, but the joy of knowing Jesus was even greater. Living as a secret Christian while maintaining my position as an imam was the most difficult period of my entire life. Every Friday, I had to stand before my congregation and deliver sermons defending Islamic theology while my heart had completely surrendered to Jesus Christ. The hypocrisy was eating me alive from the inside, but I was terrified of the consequences that would follow any public declaration of my conversion. For 3 months, I managed to maintain this double life through careful manipulation of my sermon topics. Instead of my usual aggressive attacks on Christianity, I began focusing on general moral teachings and social issues that would not directly contradict my new faith. My congregation noticed the change but attributed it to spiritual maturity or perhaps exhaustion from years of intense theological combat. They had no idea their Imam was praying to Jesus every night. The breaking point came during Ramadan preparation when the mosque committee asked me to deliver a special series called Defending Pure Islam, specifically targeting Christian missionary activities in our region. They had planned advertising throughout the community, expecting my usual passionate denunciation of Christian beliefs and my expertise in dismantling their theological arguments. I knew I could no longer participate in such an event without betraying everything I had come to believe about Jesus. That night, I made the decision that would cost me everything I had built over 2 decades of religious leadership. I could not continue living a lie, no matter how comfortable or safe that lie might be. The Jesus I now followed demanded honesty, integrity, and courage to stand for truth regardless of consequences. I had to choose between my comfortable deception and faithful obedience to my new Lord. The next morning, I requested a meeting with the mosque's governing board and the regional religious council. I told them I needed to step down from my position due to personal spiritual struggles that made me unfit to continue leading the community. I deliberately kept my explanation vague, hoping to resign quietly without revealing the specific nature of my crisis of faith. I thought perhaps I could fade away gracefully and start a new life somewhere else. But they would not accept such simple resignation from someone of my stature and reputation. The board members pressed for details, concerned that their prominent Imam was facing some kind of spiritual emergency that required intervention and support. When they offered counseling, additional study time, even a sabbatical to restore my faith, I realized that my attempt at a quiet exit was not going to work. Under increasing pressure to explain my sudden change, I finally spoke the words that would destroy my old life forever. I have come to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the only way to salvation. The silence that followed was deafening. These men who had respected me, sought my counsel, and supported my ministry for years now stared at me as if I had announced that I was mentally ill or possessed by demons. The reaction was swift and devastating. Within hours, word of my conversion had spread throughout our religious community. My wife was contacted at home and informed that her husband had committed apostasy, the most serious religious crime in our society. She initially refused to believe it, thinking someone was spreading malicious rumors about me. When I came home that evening and confirmed the truth, her world collapsed as completely as mine had. My own brother called me an apostate and traitor when the news reached our extended family. The man who had been proud to tell people his brother was a respected Imam now refused to speak my name in public. Family gatherings that had once celebrated my religious achievements became planning sessions for how to minimize the shame I had brought upon our entire lineage. Cousins who had sought my religious guidance now crossed the street to avoid encountering me. The mosque board moved quickly to distance the institution from my spiritual contamination. They announced to the congregation that I had been deceived by foreign influences and was no longer authorized to speak on Islamic matters. My office was cleaned out, my keys confiscated, and my name removed from all official documents. 23 years of faithful service were erased as if they had never existed. But the personal costs were even more devastating than the professional ones. My wife, faced with the choice between supporting her apostate husband or maintaining her standing in our community, chose to file for divorce. She took our 3 sons with her, moving back to her family's home, where they would be protected from the stigma of association with a Christian convert. my children, who had once been proud to tell their friends their father was an imam, now had to explain why their father had betrayed everything their family stood for. The financial consequences were immediate and severe. Not only had I lost my salary and benefits from the mosque, but my reputation as a Christian convert made me unemployable in most sectors of Saudi society. Businesses that had once competed for my endorsement now refused to hire me for fear of religious backlash. I went from being a respected religious leader with financial security to being essentially an unemployed pariah overnight. Yet in the midst of all this loss and persecution, I experienced a peace and joy that defied rational explanation. The same mouth that once mocked the Bible now proclaims its truth with passion and conviction. Every morning, I wake up knowing that I am forgiven, loved, and accepted by Jesus Christ, regardless of what human society thinks of me. The eternal security I have in my salvation is worth more than all the temporal things I lost. Through the underground Christian community that had helped me obtain my first Bible, I connected with other Muslim converts who had faced similar persecution. These brave men and women became my new spiritual family, supporting me through the darkest months of social exile and helping me understand how to live faithfully as a Christian in a hostile environment. Their testimonies of God's faithfulness through persecution strengthened my own resolve to endure whatever trials lay ahead. 6 months after my public conversion, I received an unexpected opportunity that confirmed God's sovereignty over my circumstances. A Christian ministry focused on reaching Muslims invited me to share my testimony and use my theological background to help train workers for evangelism in the Middle East. My expertise in Islamic teaching, once used to attack Christianity, now became a powerful tool for building bridges between faiths and helping other Muslims understand the truth about Jesus. Don't wait for your own burning moment. The same Jesus who revealed himself to me wants to meet you today. I have now shared my testimony in dozens of countries, and I have personally witnessed over 100 Muslims accept Christ as their savior after hearing about my experience. The man who once burned Bibles in arrogant defiance now treasures God's word as the most precious possession in his life. If God can change the heart of a Saudi Imam who burned his word and spent decades attacking his people, he can certainly transform your life as well. Jesus Christ is not just a prophet or a good teacher. He is the risen Lord who conquered death and offers eternal life to everyone who believes in him. I lost everything this world values when I chose to follow him, but I gained something infinitely more valuable, a personal relationship with the God of the universe, who loves me unconditionally and will never leave me or forsake me.